Forget the Vikings you think you know. They didn't wear horned helmets. They weren't simply bloodthirsty barbarians, and they didn't suddenly appear from nowhere to terrorize Europe. They were farmers, traders, explorers, slavers, settlers, and some of the most feared warriors the medieval world had ever seen. For nearly 3 centuries, they crossed oceans, conquered kingdoms, reached America, founded cities, and changed Europe forever. But the strangest part of the Viking story isn't how they rose, it's what finally made them disappear. And to understand that, we have to begin before anyone was calling them Vikings. Long before Scandinavian ships appeared off the coast of England, the people who would launch the Viking Age were living in a world shaped by geography. Norway was cut by mountains and deep fjords. Sweden opened toward the Baltic and the river systems leading east. Denmark sat at the gateway between Scandinavia and continental Europe. The sea was everywhere, and for many communities, it was not a barrier. It was a road. Most Scandinavians were not professional warriors. They farmed, raised animals, fished, hunted, and made tools, textiles, jewelry, ships, and weapons. Families lived on farmsteads connected to local communities, while powerful chieftains competed for wealth, loyalty, and prestige. There was no single Viking kingdom, no Viking emperor, no unified Viking army waiting for the order to invade Europe. Scandinavia was politically fragmented, and that fragmentation mattered. A successful leader needed followers. Followers expected rewards. Rewards required wealth. Land mattered, livestock mattered, silver mattered, and so did reputation. But Scandinavia was not isolated from the rest of Europe. Long before the Viking Age, Scandinavian merchants were connected to trading networks stretching beyond the Baltic and North Sea. Glass, weapons, luxury goods, coins, amber, furs, walrus ivory, slaves, silver. Goods moved north, other goods moved south. Scandinavians already knew that enormous wealth existed beyond their shores, and they were becoming exceptionally good at reaching it. Their ships were the key. Generations of maritime experience produced vessels that were light, flexible, and remarkably effective. They could cross open sea, sail close to shore, enter shallow rivers, and be rowed when the wind failed. That combination would create one of the great strategic advantages of the Viking Age. A European settlement might believe it was safely inland. A Viking ship could turn the river into a highway. But ships alone do not explain what happened. Historians have debated for generations why Scandinavian expansion accelerated so dramatically around the end of the 8th century. Population pressure has been suggested. Political competition, changes in trade, the search for land, silver, and slaves. Opportunities created by instability elsewhere in Europe. Probably no single explanation is enough. Different people left Scandinavia for different reasons. Some wanted wealth, some wanted land. Some traded, some explored. Some were pushed out by political rivals. And some discovered that a monastery filled with valuable objects and almost no military protection was easier to exploit than a distant trading market. And that brings us to another word modern culture has transformed: Viking. The people we call Vikings did not normally think of themselves as members of one ethnic nation called the Vikings. They were Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, people connected to particular families, communities, and rulers. The Old Norse term associated with Viking appears to have referred more closely to an activity or expedition. Going Viking was something a person could do. It was not necessarily what that person was. A farmer could spend part of his life working land in Scandinavia, and another part crossing the sea with armed companions. A trader could become a raider when opportunity appeared. A raider could become a settler. That fluidity is essential to everything that follows. The Viking Age was never simply a 300-year war between Scandinavia and Europe. It was movement, people, ships, silver, violence, trade, settlement, opportunity. By the late 8th century, all the pieces were in place. Scandinavians possessed generations of maritime knowledge. Ambitious leaders needed wealth and followers. And across the water lay Christian Europe, with monasteries containing portable wealth and coastlines impossible to defend everywhere at once. The Scandinavians knew that world existed. They had traded with it. Then some of them discovered something that would change European history: You didn't always have to trade for its wealth. You could take it. In the summer of 793, ships approached a small island off the northeastern coast of England. On that island stood a monastery, Lindisfarne. For the monks living there, what followed was simply a terrifying day. For history, it became the moment Europe noticed the Vikings. Lindisfarne was not the beginning of the Vikings. It was the moment the rest of Europe began to fear them. In 793, raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne, a sacred Christian center associated with St. Cuthbert. The violence was shocking not simply because people were killed or wealth was stolen, it was where it happened. To Christian writers, an assault on such a holy place seemed like an attack on the Christian order itself. Alcuin of York, then at the court of Charlemagne, wrote in horror about the event. But from the raiders' perspective, a wealthy religious community near the coast presented something else. Portable treasure, captives, little military protection. A vulnerable target had been discovered, and it worked. That matters because Viking success became self-reinforcing. A successful raid produced wealth. Wealth attracted followers. Followers made larger expeditions possible. Larger expeditions could attack richer targets. And every voyage produced information. Where were the monasteries? Which rivers led inland? Which settlements were poorly defended? Where could ships land? Where could silver be found? Every successful voyage could make the next one more dangerous. Raids spread around the British Isles. Ireland became a major target. Scandinavian raiders appeared around the Frankish coast. Then they began moving up rivers. The Seine led toward Paris. The Loire opened another route into Francia. Waterways that supported European trade now became vulnerabilities. If a wealthy target was vulnerable, the calculation could change. And there was another source of profit often softened in popular versions of the story. Human beings. Slavery was an important part of the Viking Age economy. Raiders captured men, women, and children and moved them through trading networks stretching across Europe and beyond. Some captives ended up in Scandinavian households. Others moved through markets connected to the Baltic, Eastern Europe, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. The Viking Age was a story of exploration and trade. It was also a story of organized violence and human trafficking. By the 9th century, the scale of Viking activity was increasing. Raiding parties became larger. Some fleets coordinated attacks. European rulers faced a brutal strategic problem. How do you defend every coastline, every river, every monastery, and every settlement? You can't. A conventional army might gather in one region while Viking ships simply moved somewhere else. Speed created uncertainty. Uncertainty created fear, and fear itself became useful. But it created an obvious problem. If threatening you produces silver, why stop? In 793, raiders struck an exposed monastery on a small island. Now Scandinavian fleets could threaten one of the most important cities in the Frankish world. Europe was adapting, but so were the Vikings. Then came the change that transformed the Viking Age completely. Some Scandinavian groups stopped going home for the winter. They stayed. Wintering overseas meant campaigns could resume earlier. Local knowledge increased, supplies could be accumulated, alliances could be made, temporary camps could become permanent footholds. The Vikings had first appeared like storms, arrive, attack, disappear. Now the storm wasn't leaving. In Ireland, Viking bases developed into settlements and trading centers. Dublin would become one of the most important. In Francia, Scandinavian leaders learned to negotiate with kings as well as attack them. And in England, the consequences would become even greater. In 865, a major Scandinavian force arrived, remembered by later tradition as the Great Heathen Army. This time, the goal was not simply to strike a monastery, fill the ships and sail home. The Vikings were coming for kingdoms. But before we follow that army, we need to understand why European forces found these men so difficult to stop. The answer was not that every Viking was an unstoppable warrior. It wasn't even their axes. Their greatest weapon was the ship. Without the ship, the Viking Age as we know it probably could not have happened. Scandinavian shipbuilders adapted vessels to a world of fjords, islands, open seas, and shallow waterways. There was no single universal Viking ship. Some vessels carried cargo. Others were built for speed and war. But the famous longships combined several characteristics with devastating effect. They were relatively light, fast, shallow drafted, powered by both sail and oars. A crew could cross open water, approach a coastline, land directly on a beach, and leave quickly. On rivers, the same ships could carry armed men deep inland. The ship did more than transport the warrior. It allowed him to choose when and where the fight happened. That is an enormous advantage. But eventually, Vikings did have to fight. So what did the real Viking warrior look like? Not like the popular image. The horned helmet belongs largely to a much later romantic imagination. There is no good evidence that Viking warriors routinely entered battle wearing helmets with enormous horns. Actual equipment varied according to wealth and status. An ordinary fighter might carry a spear and wooden shield. Axes were common tools that could also become effective weapons. Swords existed, but a good sword was expensive and prestigious. Some warriors had helmets, some had mail armor. Many probably did not. There was no standardized Viking uniform. What mattered was not identical equipment, it was experience. A successful expedition demanded discipline long before battle began. Men had to row together, sail together, repair ships, navigate dangerous water, manage food, land quickly, move supplies, and trust the people beside them. The romantic image focuses on the moment the axe comes down. The real advantage began weeks earlier. It began with logistics. Navigation was another part of that skill. Viking sailors crossed sections of the North Atlantic without modern compasses, GPS, or accurate charts. Exactly how they navigated in every situation remains debated. But experienced sailors could use coastlines, landmarks, currents, winds, stars, the sun, birds, and accumulated knowledge of routes. They needed to know how to survive it, and they did. Then there is the most famous Viking warrior of all, the berserker. Later, Norse literature describes warriors associated with extraordinary battle fury. But the historical reality is difficult to reconstruct. The evidence does not allow us to recreate a reliable Viking berserker ritual the way movies often do, and reputation itself can become a weapon. What made them terrifying was how effectively they could deliver it to places that thought they were safe. A monastery, a river town, an isolated estate, a coastal settlement, and increasingly, a kingdom. There was another reason they became dangerous. They adapted. Scandinavian forces learned from the enemies they faced. They adopted useful equipment, entered local politics, made alliances, accepted payments, entered the service of foreign rulers, and sometimes fought other Vikings. The Viking Age was never simply Vikings versus everyone else. Scandinavian groups competed with one another constantly. A Danish leader could fight another Dane. Vikings could ally with local rulers against other Vikings. Opportunity often mattered more than imagined Scandinavian unity, and that flexibility made them harder to remove. A raiding party can be defeated. But what happens when the raiders begin understanding your roads, your rivers, your political rivalries, your harvest cycles, and your kings? What happens when they stop asking, "What can we steal?" and begin asking, "What can we keep?" By the middle of the 9th century, that transformation was underway. England presented an extraordinary opportunity. There was no single unified English kingdom waiting for them. Instead, there were competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. The Vikings did not need to defeat England. England did not yet exist in the form we know today. They could attack its kingdoms one at a time. In 865, the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. Its exact size is unknown, but its impact is not. The force took horses, wintered in captured territory, negotiated, conquered, installed rulers, and killed kings. Within only a few years, political structures that had existed for generations began to collapse. The Viking ship had delivered the raiders. Now the raiders were becoming an army. And the army was about to discover that the richest prize was not silver, it was land. In 865, the Viking threat to Anglo-Saxon England changed in scale. And whatever their family story really was, the campaigns associated with their generation transformed England. The Vikings first secured horses in East Anglia, increasing their speed on land. Then they moved north. Their target was Northumbria. And Northumbria was already divided. Two rival kings, Osbert and Ella, were fighting for control. The Vikings had arrived at exactly the right moment. In 866, they captured York. The following year, the rival Northumbrian kings joined forces and attempted to retake the city. Both were killed. The certainty did not. What is certain is more important. Northumbria had been broken. The Vikings moved into Mercia, then East Anglia. In 869, the East Anglian king Edmund was killed. Later, Christian tradition transformed him into Saint Edmund the Martyr. Again, legend and history overlap, but the political result is clear. Within a few years, 3 of England's major kingdoms had been defeated or profoundly weakened. Only one remained capable of resisting on a large scale: Wessex. And there, the Viking expansion encountered its most famous Anglo-Saxon opponent, Alfred, later known as Alfred the Great. When the Vikings attacked Wessex in 871, Alfred was not king at first. His older brother Ethelred ruled. The year became one of relentless warfare. Then Ethelred died. Alfred inherited the throne, probably in his early 20s, and inherited a kingdom under enormous pressure. Eventually, a temporary peace was reached. The Vikings moved elsewhere, but they had not abandoned England. They were reorganizing it. Some members of the Great Army began settling in conquered territory. Land was divided. Warriors became farmers and landholders. A man could arrive with a sword and stay with a plow. Conquest was becoming colonization. Then, in 878, Alfred's situation became desperate. A Viking force led by Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack. Alfred was forced into hiding in the marshes of Somerset. The reality was dramatic enough. A king had lost control of much of his kingdom and was rebuilding resistance from the wetlands. If Alfred failed, Wessex could follow Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. Alfred gathered supporters. Then he returned. At the Battle of Edington, his forces defeated Guthrum. The victory did not drive every Viking out of England. Alfred did something more practical. He negotiated. Guthrum accepted baptism. A political settlement followed. Over time, a broad division emerged between territory controlled by Anglo-Saxon rulers and areas under Scandinavian influence. Later, historians would call much of the latter region the Danelaw. It was not a perfectly fixed Viking country with one clear border. It was a zone where Scandinavian political power and legal customs had become deeply established, and its influence was enormous. Scandinavian settlers farmed, married, traded, founded communities, and adopted elements of Christianity. The Viking invasion was becoming something stranger than conquest. The conquerors were changing England, and England was changing them. Alfred understood that military victory alone would not solve the problem. The Vikings could always return. So Wessex adapted. Fortified settlements, burhs, formed part of a defensive network. Military obligations were reorganized. Naval forces were developed. The goal was simple in principle and difficult in practice: make England harder to raid. This pattern would repeat across the Viking world. Every successful raid taught Scandinavians something. Every Viking attack taught Europeans something too. Alfred died in 899, but the struggle continued through his children and successors. Viking-held territory was not simply erased, it was incorporated. And from the conflict, something larger was emerging: England. By the 10th century, rulers descended from Alfred increasingly claimed authority over a unified English kingdom. But the Viking threat was not finished. New Scandinavian attacks would come. Eventually, a Danish king would rule all England, Knut the Great. In the early 11th century, Knut built a North Sea empire connecting England, Denmark, and Norway. A descendant of the world of Viking raiders now sat on one of Europe's richest thrones. The first raiders struck quickly and fled. The next generation seized territory. Settlers built communities, and eventually Scandinavian rulers became kings of the states their ancestors had once raided. The distinction between Viking and European ruler was beginning to blur, and England was only one part of this transformation. While armies fought Alfred and his descendants in the west, other Scandinavians were traveling in directions that make the familiar Viking story seem surprisingly small. Some crossed the North Atlantic. Others followed rivers thousands of kilometers east. They traded with the Islamic world. They entered the service of Byzantine emperors. They helped shape political networks associated with the Rus. And centuries before Columbus, Scandinavians reached North America. The Viking world was about to become much larger. The Vikings did not expand in one direction. They went west. They went east. They crossed the North Atlantic. They followed rivers toward the Black Sea. They traded with the Islamic world, and their routes stretched from North America to Constantinople. To the west, Norwegian settlers moved through the North Atlantic. The Faroe Islands became part of this expanding Scandinavian world. Then came Iceland. Norse settlement there began in the late 9th century. In 930, Icelanders established the Althing, an assembly where disputes could be heard, laws recited, and political relationships negotiated. It was not a modern democracy. Power remained unequal. Feuds could become violent. Slavery existed. But it reminds us again that Viking society cannot be reduced to raiding. These people were building communities, and they kept moving west. Norse communities were established along Greenland's southwestern coast. They farmed livestock, built churches, hunted, and traded valuable products, including walrus ivory. But even Greenland was not the end. Leif Erikson. According to the sagas, Norse explorers reached lands west of Greenland around the year 1000. At Lonsø Meadows, on the northern tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists discovered unmistakable evidence of a Norse presence. Norse-style buildings, ironworking, and artifacts associated with Scandinavian occupation. Modern dating has provided strong evidence for Norse activity there in AD 1021. Nearly 5 centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, Europeans had already reached North America. But we should be careful with what that means. The Vikings did not conquer North America. They did not create a permanent Scandinavian civilization across the continent. Lonsø Meadows appears to have been a relatively small and short-lived base. The extraordinary achievement was not that the Vikings created a new empire there. It was that they reached it at all. Now move to the opposite side of the Viking world. While Scandinavians pushed west across the Atlantic, Swedish and other Eastern Scandinavian groups traveled through the Baltic and into the great river systems of Eastern Europe. Here they are often associated with the name Varangians. Scandinavian merchants and warriors interacted with Finnic, Baltic, Slavic, steppe, and other populations. Out of these complex networks emerged political centers associated with the Rus, and those networks led south toward one of the richest cities on earth, Constantinople. To Scandinavians, it became known as Miklagard, the Great City. A traveler from a Scandinavian farmstead approaching Constantinople would encounter massive walls, imperial palaces, crowded markets and churches on a scale almost unimaginable back home. Some Scandinavians came to trade, others came to fight, and some were hired to protect the emperor himself. The Varangian Guard became an elite military unit associated with Byzantine imperial service. Scandinavian warriors, and later many Anglo-Saxons, served within it. A man could leave northern Europe, travel thousands of kilometers, and end up guarding the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. But Constantinople was not the end of the network. Thousands of Islamic silver coins have been discovered in Scandinavia and around the Baltic world, revealing connections deep into the Islamic economy. A contemporary glimpse of northern traders far from Scandinavia. Now step back and look at the map. Around the year 1000, people from the Scandinavian world had reached North America in the west. Greenland and Iceland were settled. Viking communities existed across parts of Britain and Ireland. Normandy had Scandinavian origins. Networks extended through Eastern Europe to Constantinople. Islamic silver traveled north toward the Baltic. This was not an empire. There was no Viking government controlling all of it. It was something more fluid, a network created by ships, rivers, violence, commerce, migration, and opportunity. And this may be the greatest correction to the popular Viking image. Their achievement was not simply that they could destroy, it was that they could connect. A sword made them dangerous, a ship made them mobile, but a network made their influence enormous. The deeper they entered other societies, the more those societies changed them in return. Vikings in England became landowners. Vikings in Ireland built trading towns. Vikings in the east entered Slavic political worlds. Vikings in Byzantium served a Christian emperor. Settlers in Iceland created new institutions. The farther the Viking world expanded, the harder it became to define exactly what a Viking was. And by the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Scandinavian rulers themselves were changing. Kings were becoming stronger. Christianity was spreading. Political territories were consolidating. The world that had produced independent raiders and competing war leaders was slowly being replaced by states, kingdoms, and churches. The Vikings were reaching the height of their influence, and without realizing it, they were beginning to build the world that would make the Viking Age disappear. The more successful the Vikings became, the less Viking their world began to look. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Scandinavians were no longer appearing in European records only as raiders. They were merchants, landowners, urban settlers, mercenaries, Christians, and increasingly kings. An ordinary life explains how Scandinavian influence became permanent. A raider can remain an outsider. A settler eventually needs land, neighbors, markets, marriage, law, and children. Over generations, identities blur. Normandy emerged from exactly this process. In the early 10th century, the Frankish king Charles the Simple reached an agreement with the Scandinavian leader Rollo. Rollo received territory around the Lower Seine. In return, he was expected to defend the region, including against other Viking raiders. Think about the reversal. A Scandinavian leader had once represented the threat. Now a Scandinavian ruler was being used as protection against that same threat. The territory became Normandy, the land of the Northmen. But Rollo's descendants adopted the local language, Christianity, and Frankish political customs. Within generations, they had become Normans, and the Normans would eventually become one of the most formidable military forces in medieval Europe. The transformation was happening in Scandinavia too. For much of the early Viking Age, power had been fragmented among local rulers and chieftains. Gradually, larger kingdoms emerged. One ruler left an extraordinary monument to this transition: Harald Bluetooth. Kingship was changing, religion was changing. Christianity had been present around Scandinavia before Harald. Merchants encountered Christians abroad. Missionaries traveled north. Scandinavians serving or settling in Christian lands could convert. Conversion was not one event. It was a long, uneven process. But Christianity brought Scandinavia more deeply into European political and religious institutions. Christian kings could form relationships with other Christian rulers. Church organization reinforced royal authority. Written administration expanded. The ideological world of the independent pagan war leader was being transformed. And then Viking power reached an extraordinary political peak: Knut the Great. Knut was the son of the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard, who had successfully invaded England. After Sweyn's death, conflict over the English throne continued. Eventually, Knut prevailed. In 1016, he became King of England. Later, he also became King of Denmark and Norway, creating what historians often call the North Sea Empire. For a brief period, one ruler controlled territories on both sides of the sea that earlier Vikings had crossed as raiders. But look at how Knut ruled, not simply as a raiding chief. As a Christian medieval king, he worked with the English church, issued laws, used existing institutions, traveled to Rome, participated in European royal politics. This is one of the central paradoxes of Viking success. The ultimate achievement of Viking conquest was often to stop behaving like a Viking raider. Scandinavian elites became integrated into the states they entered. Christianity spread. Settlements became towns. Kings gained more control over violence. But before the Viking Age ended, Scandinavian power would produce one final generation of extraordinary ambition. England remained one of the richest prizes in Northern Europe, and the struggle for its throne would bring together three men in one remarkable year: a Norwegian king who represented the old heroic world of Viking warfare, an English king fighting to preserve his crown, and a Norman duke whose ancestors had once been Vikings. The year was 1066. At the beginning of our story, Scandinavia was politically fragmented. By the 11th century, stronger kingdoms were emerging. At the beginning, Christianity was the religion of many of the people Vikings attacked. Now Scandinavian kings were Christians themselves. At the beginning, Vikings exploited weak defenses. Now European rulers had spent generations learning how to fight them. Their success had changed Europe. Their success had changed Scandinavia. And those changes were slowly removing the conditions that had made the Viking Age possible. The Vikings were not losing because they had forgotten how to fight. They were losing something more fundamental. The world that created them was disappearing. The Viking Age was ending because almost everything that had made it possible was changing. Europe had learned, Scandinavia had changed, and the Vikings themselves were becoming part of the world they once attacked. For generations, Viking success depended on speed. A fleet appeared, a settlement was attacked, wealth was taken. Before a large defensive force could arrive, the ships were gone. But after more than 2 centuries of raids, European rulers understood the threat. England developed fortified towns and organized defenses. Frankish rulers protected important river routes. Coastal defenses improved. Political authorities became better at mobilizing forces. The easy targets were becoming harder to find. Kings were becoming stronger on both sides of the conflict. Then came Christianity. It was becoming more deeply integrated into it. And that is the central irony. The Viking Age was ending partly because the Vikings had succeeded. They had opened routes, created settlements, founded towns, captured kingdoms, moved people and silver, connected markets, inserted themselves into European politics. Eventually, they stopped being outsiders. But the old tradition of Scandinavian conquest had not disappeared yet. Edward the Confessor. When Edward died without a child in January 1066, the question of succession triggered one of the most famous political crises of the Middle Ages. 3 men would define the year: Harold Godwinson, Harold Hardrada, William of Normandy. Harold Godwinson was one of the most powerful nobles in England. After Edward's death, he was crowned king. Across the North Sea, Harold Sigurdsson, Harold Hardrada, believed England could still be won through Scandinavian conquest. In 1066, he launched his invasion of England, supported by Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of King Harold. The Norwegian fleet sailed to northern England. At the Battle of Fulford, Hardrada and Tostig defeated an English force. For a moment, the old pattern seemed to be repeating itself. A Scandinavian army had arrived. A major city had fallen under pressure. England appeared vulnerable, but England in 1066 was not England in 866. King Harold responded with remarkable speed. His army marched north. On September 25th, the English surprised the Norwegian forces near Stamford Bridge. The battle was brutal. Harold Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The invasion collapsed. Stamford Bridge is often described as the end of the Viking Age. Symbolically, it is difficult to find a better moment. A Norwegian king whose life stretched from Scandinavia to Byzantium had launched one of the last great Scandinavian attempts to conquer England. He died on an English battlefield, but history rarely respects clean endings. Only days later, another fleet reached England. This army also had Scandinavian ancestry, but its warriors were not usually called Vikings. They were Normans. Their leader was William, Duke of Normandy, a descendant of the political world created when Rollo and his followers settled in Francia generations earlier. The Normans spoke French. They were Christians. Their political culture was deeply integrated into Western Europe. They were not Vikings in the old sense, but Viking expansion was part of their ancestry. Harold Godwinson turned his exhausted army around and marched south. On October 14th, 1066, he met William's forces at Hastings. Harold was killed. William won. The Norman conquest of England began. Look at the strange symmetry. At Stamford Bridge, an invasion associated with the old Scandinavian Viking world was defeated. At Hastings, descendants of Scandinavian settlers conquered England in a new form. That is why 1066 works so well as a symbolic ending. Not because every Viking vanished, they didn't. Not because Scandinavian expansion stopped completely, it didn't. But because the system had changed. The raider had become the settler had become the landowner. The chieftain had become the king. The pagan had become the Christian. The trading settlement had become the medieval town. and Scandinavia had become part of Christian Europe. The Viking Age did not end because somebody finally destroyed the Vikings. It ended because being a Viking was becoming less and less relevant to the world Scandinavians now inhabited. But that leaves one final question. If the Vikings did not simply disappear, what happened to them? The answer is everywhere. The Vikings did not vanish. They became something else. Consider England. Scandinavian armies once arrived as foreign invaders, but settlers farmed English land, married into local communities, traded in English towns, and raised children in a world shaped by both cultures. The evidence survives in the landscape. Across northern and eastern England, place names preserve Scandinavian influence. Names ending in by, from the Old Norse word associated with a farm or settlement. Others preserve thorp, associated with smaller settlements. They are traces of ordinary people who stayed. The same thing happened to language. Old Norse and Old English were related Germanic languages, and sustained contact left a permanent mark. English absorbed words of Scandinavian origin. Even basic pronouns, they, them, their, reflect Norse influence. In Normandy, the transformation went even further. Rollo's descendants became French-speaking Christian nobles, and in 1066, William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel and conquered England. The descendant of Viking settlers had become a medieval European duke. And in Scandinavia itself, the transformation was perhaps most profound. Denmark, Norway, Sweden. These were becoming Christian kingdoms integrated into medieval Europe. The Viking Age ended. Scandinavia did not. Stories. But it tells us a great deal about how history becomes mythology. Today, say the word Viking, and many people still picture the same figure. Huge, bearded, covered in fur, horned helmet, axe raised. But after everything we've seen, that image feels strangely incomplete. Because the real Vikings were much harder to define. A Viking could be a raider, but he could also be a merchant, farmer, shipbuilder, settler, mercenary, explorer, slave trader, poet, political exile, or king. The same person could be several of those things during one lifetime. That complexity is why the Viking story matters. They did not build one enormous empire. They did not create a single centralized civilization stretching across everything they touched. Their influence spread differently, through movement. A Scandinavian ship enters an English river. A merchant carries Islamic silver north. A family settles in Iceland. A warrior reaches Constantinople. A Norse ship crosses from Greenland toward North America. A Danish king takes the English throne. A Scandinavian settlement becomes Dublin. The descendants of another Scandinavian settlement become Normans. Each event seems separate. Together, they form one of the most extraordinary periods of movement in medieval history. And now we can return to the question we asked at the beginning. What finally made the Vikings disappear? The answer is almost a contradiction. Success. Their ships opened routes. Those routes created trade. Trade created wealth. Wealth strengthened rulers. Conquests created settlements. Settlements created permanent communities. Conversion connected Scandinavia to Christian Europe. Kings centralized power. European defenses improved. The political and economic world changed. The Vikings helped transform Europe, and Europe transformed them. So when Harold Hardrada fell at Stamford Bridge in 1066, it was not the death of a people, it was the closing of a chapter. For almost 3 centuries, Scandinavian sailors crossed the North Atlantic, reached North America, navigated the rivers of Eastern Europe, traded with the Islamic world, served emperors in Constantinople, attacked Paris, conquered parts of England, founded settlements, and built kingdoms. But perhaps the most surprising thing about the Vikings is not how violent they were, or how far they traveled, or how much territory they conquered. It is how completely they were eventually absorbed into the world they had helped reshape. The age of the Vikings ended, but the Vikings themselves never really disappeared. They became Europeans. And behind the legends, the horned helmets, and the mythology, that is the true story of the warriors who changed Europe. And we already know how that story ends. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We put out something like this every single day, the version of the story that survives contact with the actual evidence. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment, a real one. Tell me what part of this actually surprised you. And tell me what civilization, what forgotten site, what quiet piece of hidden history you want us to look at next. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging,